Welcome to Biology of Marine Mammals. Today's topic is all about the marine environment, or the environment in which marine mammals live. So to get started, we're going to introduce the major oceans of the world, of which there are 5. Then we're going to turn and take a look at where might marine mammals actually live within those major oceans. That's a special topic that's called zoogeography. And from there, we're going to turn to 2 major forces that determine a particular marine mammal's zoogeography, or where they live. Those are going to be looking at sea surface temperatures and also where their food is. Where their food is, it's tied into a special concept known as primary productivity. Okay, let's go ahead and get started by looking at the world's oceans. In this generic map, we see that the majority of Earth's surface is indeed covered by water, and 71% of that, the Earth's surface, is covered by oceans, 5 major oceans to be exact. Now, 2 of those oceans are probably going to be pretty familiar to you because they flank the United States. On the west coast, of course, we have the Pacific Ocean, which is the largest ocean, and then we have the Atlantic Ocean on the east coast. There's an additional ocean that also spans tropical and subtropical waters, and this is found around Asia, Africa, and Australia, and this is known as the Indian Ocean. You might notice from the map that the Indian Ocean is a little different than the Atlantic and the Pacific because it doesn't extend all the way through both hemispheres like the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean do. Now that we've covered the oceans that are pretty obvious and near most major land masses, let's cover the 2 oceans that are found in really cold and polar habitats. In the North Pole area, the ocean that exhibits that area is called the Arctic Ocean, and then in the southern area around Antarctica, we indeed have the Southern Ocean. So again, Arctic Ocean in the north and Southern Ocean way down in the south around Antarctica. So now that we've looked at the 5 major oceans, let's move on and talk about marine mammal distribution. Okay, one of the major aspects of studying marine mammals is looking at where they live. And not only where they live, but why they live in that particular area. Such a concept is called zoogeography. So when somebody says, I want to know about the zoogeography of a particular marine mammal, let's just say an orca or a killer whale, then what they're really asking is, where do those orcas live and why do they live in those particular areas? So orcas are actually a special case because they're one of the few cosmopolitan species. A cosmopolitan species is going to be one that is found globally or worldwide. And there are 2 major cosmopolitan marine mammals, orcas being one of them. In fact, orcas are kind of special because they're the second most common cosmopolitan organism behind humans. So humans are the most cosmopolitan organism, and then orcas are second. The other one, though, is actually sperm whales. So those being kind of the 2 exceptions, most marine mammals do not exhibit a worldwide distribution and are limited to a much more confined ocean or space. So when you look at a particular marine mammal, let's just say the California sea lion, which is going to be found along the Pacific coast in temperate waters, you might ask, well, why are they found there and not maybe in tropical waters? So then we're going to take a look at what major factors determine where an organism lives. And the 2 major factors that drive the zoogeography of marine mammals are going to be both the sea surface temperatures. What I mean by that is going to be the temperature of the surface of the water, and also, of course, where the food is. The more food you have, the more likely you're going to find marine mammals in that area. All right, so let's take a look at these 2 governing forces in a little bit more detail. We'll start with sea surface temperatures. Here's a map that shows the sea surface temperatures of the entire world. And of course, the trends are striking. Red is going to represent warmer temperatures, blue is going to represent colder temperatures, and we see from this map that in the tropical area or close to the lower latitudes around the equator, we see, of course, lots of red. That means very warm. And as you move away from the equator, Towards more temperate environments or mid-latitudes, it gets a little colder. And then, of course, around the poles, as you'd expect, very, very cold waters. So let's try to summarize that globally and take a look at these trends. Okay, it doesn't really matter what ocean you're in, whether you're in the Pacific Ocean, the Atlantic Ocean, the Southern Ocean, the Arctic Ocean. We're going to see generic trends of sea surface temperature based on latitude. And of course, 0 is going to represent the equator. So when we talk about low latitudes, we're saying close to the equator. When we say high latitudes, we're really looking at either end of the pole, so closer to the poles on either end. All right, so of course, tropical waters, these are going to be the low latitudes. They have the highest consistent temperatures, so sometimes exceeding 25 degrees Celsius. These are very, very warm waters, very nice for swimming in. People like to vacation to tropical waters because they're so friendly, of course, to humans for swimming. Maybe not friendly to marine mammals, as we're going to see here in a little while. On the flip side of that, we go to the very high latitudes, or the polar waters, and they have consistently cold temperatures year-round. And those temperatures are close to, if not actually exceeding freezing. So very, very, very cold. Now, the mid-latitudes, which is where California is located, you know, the Carolinas on the East Coast, that area, the mid-latitudes have, of course, the middle of the range temperatures, kind of an in-between between polar and tropical, but interestingly, not always very consistent throughout the year. So what we see here is we see actually a lot of seasonal variation, where summer brings warmer waters and winter brings cooler waters. Of interesting note, the Atlantic Ocean actually shows a lot more seasonal variability than the Pacific Ocean does. So temperature ranges are much more extreme in the Atlantic Ocean than they are in the Pacific Ocean. All right, now that we've looked at that, let's turn and move on to the idea of a food web. The food web is basically the idea of whom eats whom in the marine environment. And right here, we're going to go through a generic food web that describes how food might pass from one organism to another in the Antarctic or the Southern Ocean. So of course, you'll notice that the food web starts small and moves upwards, because in each step we're saying that particular organism consumed one directly below it. If you have a pen and pencil, you might want to try to sketch this out as we go ahead and go through the basics of this food web. So we start out at the bottom. The bottom of the food web is called phytoplankton. Phytoplankton make up the bottom of pretty much every food web in the marine environment. Not everyone, but most of them. Phytoplankton are going to be small, single-celled organisms that capture sunlight energy. So they ultimately use energy from the sun to make their tissue. Now, of course, small animals love them and consume them. And so these small animals, including a special type of animal called krill, which is about the length of your finger, and it looks like a shrimp, eat these small organisms. Other ones that eat them are going to be copepods. So these are animals eating almost a plant-like single-celled organism. And then, of course, from there, we're going to move on to our small fish. Penguins can also feed there, and then squid as well. So these are some of the major organisms that are feeding on these zooplankton animals. And then finally, we get into some of our marine mammals here. So with the marine mammals, you see we have crab-eater seals, leopard seals, and other pinnipeds. You don't really have to know that crab-eater seals are a little different than leopard seals just yet, but you can kind of see where the pinnipeds fall out as a whole. In other words, they're consuming things like krill, penguins, fish, squid, and then you can see way up at the top there the Mysticeti, or the great whales. And if you look at their arrow, they go directly from krill all the way up. So notice the Mysticetes are actually not consuming things like penguins and squid and pinnipeds. They're actually consuming really small stuff. So you have these giant whales consuming things the size of one of my fingers. All right, that's a very detailed food web, so it sometimes helps to simplify it into what is known as a food chain. A food chain is a much more linear progression of how food flows. So we're going to simplify this a little bit into a food chain. Again, starting with the phytoplankton. Always start with the phytoplankton. What we call the abundance of phytoplankton is primary productivity. In other words, if you talk about waters that have a high primary productivity, you are saying they have a lot of phytoplankton. The organisms that consume that phytoplankton are going to be the small animals like krill. And of course, from there you have your fish that consume that krill. And then generically, we say most of our marine mammals are going to be one step beyond that, such as our odontocetes, like our dolphins, and our pinnipeds, like our seals. Now, this represents a generic and simplified food chain for most marine mammals. But conspicuously absent from this picture are going to be the mysticetes. And that is because even though they're huge, they're really not at the end, they're more towards the middle. So we can draw some arrows there going to our great whales. Again, great whales consume things that are smaller, krill, and maybe some small fish. All right, so what does this have to do with where marine mammals are distributed? Well, it makes sense then that the more phytoplankton you have, the more krill you're going to have. The more krill you have, the more fish you're going to have. So therefore, the more marine mammals you're going to have. Marine mammals like to live in areas where there is lots and lots of food, and that's because they're huge and they have a high caloric need for their day. So they can't get by on little skimpy amounts of krill. They need a lot of krill, or they need a lot of fish. So more fish, more krill is going to be found in areas with more phytoplankton. For that reason, we are definitely concerned with where is there more phytoplankton. And for that, we can take a look at a special type of map called a chlorophyll map. The chlorophyll map shows a colored distribution of where the primary productivity is. And in this case, the reds actually represent an abundance, and the dark blues represent a very, very low amount. So even though most people like to travel to the tropics and they like the warm water, you might notice that the tropical areas, the low latitude areas, they don't have actually a lot of phytoplankton. Most of the phytoplankton is really showing up in the higher latitudes or the colder water. So we say colder waters tend to have more primary productivity than warmer waters as a generic trend, as do areas along certain coasts. So again, let's kind of summarize this. We say for primary productivity, we're going to have higher amounts in colder waters than warmer waters. So this is definitely going to influence marine mammal distribution because they need lots of primary productivity. So for that reason, they're going to be drawn to colder waters. And then again, coastal areas also have higher numbers of primary productivity, at least some coasts do. So we might see an abundance of marine mammals near some coasts as well. All right, so where do we find them? We tend to find them where their food is. And of course, where is their food? In colder waters. So as a generic rule, marine mammals, especially types like mysticeti and pinnipeds, tend to show what is known as an anti-tropical distribution. Even though you'd think warm water is wonderful, they usually have difficulty finding enough food there. They tend to say, I'm willing to take the colder waters to find enough food near the poles. So lots of marine mammals in the Southern Ocean, lots of marine mammals in the Arctic, and quite a few, especially smaller dolphins and pinnipeds along the coast. Thank you, and I'll see you next time.